Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I want to tell you about a book. Not just any book, but a book so feared, so controversial, so wrapped in whispers and warnings across nearly 8 centuries, that kings ordered it burned, scholars declared its readers heretics, and libraries hid it behind locked doors reserved only for the most trusted of trusted men. This book has been called cursed, it has been called forbidden, it has been called by some of the most respected minds in Islamic history, a gateway to ruin, and yet, despite every attempt to erase it from human memory, it survived. It multiplied. It traveled across deserts and oceans, hidden in saddlebags and sewn into the linings of coats, copied by candlelight in the back rooms of madrasas where such copying was forbidden. Its name is Shams al-Ma'rifa, which translates roughly as the son of knowledge or the son of gnosis. And tonight I want to walk you through the strange, tangled, and often frightening story of why this book became, in the eyes of so many scholars across so many centuries, the most dangerous book ever written. Let us begin at the beginning, because to understand why a book becomes dangerous, we first have to understand who wrote it and why. The man credited with authoring Shams al-Ma'rifa was Ahmad ibn Ali al-Buni, a scholar and mystic who lived roughly between the middle of the 12th century and the early years of the 13th century. We do not know a great deal about his early life. He is believed to have been born in the region of Boune, in what is today Algeria, though some accounts place his origins elsewhere in North Africa. What we do know is that he eventually made his way east to Egypt and settled for a time in Cairo, a city that in that era was one of the great intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. Cairo at that time was a meeting point of scholars, mystics, physicians, astronomers, and theologians. It was a city where the rational sciences inherited from the Greeks mingled with the spiritual sciences of Sufism, and where numerology, astrology, and the study of the hidden meanings of Arabic letters were taken seriously by serious men. Al-Buni was, by most accounts, a Sufi, a practitioner of the mystical branch of Islam that emphasizes direct personal experience of the divine over dry legalism. Sufism in that period was rich with symbolic thinking. Its practitioners often believed that the letters of the Arabic alphabet and the 99 names of God recited throughout Islamic devotional practice carried hidden power. This was not seen by many of its practitioners as separate from religion. It was seen as religion taken to its deepest and most esoteric level. Al-Buni immersed himself in this world. He studied what was known as Ilm al-Huruf, the science of letters, and Ilm al-Afaq, the science of magic squares, arrangements of numbers where every row, column, and diagonal adds up to the same sum. He studied the movements of the planets and how they were believed to correspond with certain names of God, certain angels, certain moments favorable for certain kinds of requests. And out of decades of this study, he composed what would become his most famous, most controversial, and most enduring work. Now, here is where the story becomes complicated, because scholars to this day are not entirely certain what Al-Buni actually wrote versus what was added to his work after his death. This is a crucial point, and I want you to hold on to it, because it explains much of why the book became so feared. The text that circulates today under the title Shams al-Ma'rifa al-Kubra, the greater son of knowledge, is a sprawling, enormous compilation. It is not a slim volume you could read in an evening. It is a vast collection of material covering the divine names of God and their supposed properties, elaborate magic squares meant to be inscribed on talismans, instructions for constructing amulets, discussions of the properties of specific verses of the Quran, when written and worn or recited under certain conditions, material on astrology and the influence of planetary hours, and, most controversially of all, material dealing with the invocation and binding of jinn, the unseen beings described in Islamic cosmology as created from smokeless fire. This last category is what caused the most alarm among orthodox religious scholars. Islamic theology has always maintained a delicate and cautious relationship with the unseen world. The Quran acknowledges the existence of jinn as a category of creation parallel to humanity, capable of belief and disbelief, capable of good and evil. But mainstream Islamic scholarship has, from a very early period, treated any attempt to summon, command, bind, or bargain with jinn as a spiritually perilous act, bordering on or crossing into what is termed shirk, the association of partners with God, which is considered the gravest sin in Islamic theology. The logic here is not superstitious squeamishness. It reflects a deep theological principle, that power over the unseen belongs to God alone, and that a human being who seeks to manipulate unseen forces through incantation and ritual is, whether they intend it or not, placing their trust in something other than God. Shams al-Ma'rifa, in its most widely circulated form, contains material that appears to instruct readers in precisely this kind of practice. And that is why, almost from the moment it began to circulate widely, it drew condemnation. One of the earliest and most influential critics of this entire genre of literature was the towering 14th century scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, a jurist whose writings continue to shape conservative Islamic thought to this day. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote extensively against what he considered to be the corruption of authentic Islamic spirituality by magical practices dressed up in religious language. He did not always name Al-Buni directly in every polemic, but the tradition of letter magic, talismanic construction, and jinn invocation that Al-Buni's name became attached to was squarely within his sights. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that such practices represented a dangerous blending of sanctioned religious devotion with what was in essence sorcery, and that sorcery, regardless of the pious language used to dress it, was forbidden and spiritually corrosive. He was not alone. Another towering intellectual figure, Ibn Khaldun, the great historian and social theorist of the 14th century, discussed Al-Buni and the broader tradition of magic squares and letter mysticism in his monumental work, the Muqaddimah. Ibn Khaldun was, in some ways, more measured than Ibn Taymiyyah. He treated the science of letters as a real intellectual tradition, worth describing and analyzing, tracing its philosophical roots and its practitioners. But even Ibn Khaldun expressed deep unease about the practical application of this knowledge, warning that it shaded into territory that was religiously suspect and potentially spiritually dangerous for those who pursued it without proper grounding. This tension is really at the heart of why Shams al-Ma'rifa became so notorious. It was not dismissed by serious scholars as mere nonsense, the way one might dismiss a book of children's fairy tales. It was taken seriously, and it was precisely because it was taken seriously that it was considered dangerous. If the book had been regarded as empty superstition with no real power, it would likely have been ignored, allowed to gather dust, and forgotten. Instead, generations of scholars, mystics, and rulers behaved as though the techniques described within its pages might actually work, might actually tap into real unseen forces, and that this possibility made the book a serious threat to the spiritual and even social order. A book of empty words does not need to be burned. A book that might actually do something is a different matter entirely, and there were, throughout history, real consequences attached to the belief that this book, and books like it, held genuine power. There are historical accounts, some more reliably documented than others, of rulers and religious authorities across the Islamic world, ordering the confiscation and destruction of copies of Shams al-Marifa and related occult manuscripts. In various periods, possessing such texts was treated as evidence of involvement in sorcery, which in many jurisdictions across Islamic history carried severe legal penalties, in some cases capital punishment. Religious courts in various eras prosecuted individuals accused of practicing magic, and the presence of a copy of Al-Buni's work, or works attributed to him, in a person's possession could be used as damning evidence in such proceedings. This created a strange and dangerous situation for the book itself. Simply owning it could place a person under suspicion, and yet the demand for it never disappeared. If anything, the aura of danger surrounding it seemed to increase its appeal among certain circles. Those seeking hidden knowledge, protection through amulets, or influence over the unseen world that ordinary religious practice did not seem to offer. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the book's history, which is the sheer difficulties scholars have had in pinning down exactly what the original text said. Because copying by hand was the only method of reproduction for centuries, and because the material within Shams al-Marifa was considered so potent and so secretive, copyists across generations added to it, subtracted from it, and altered it according to their own knowledge, their own regional traditions, and sometimes their own agendas. What began in Al-Buni's own lifetime as a more modest and arguably more philosophically grounded exploration of letter mysticism and the divine names appears to have grown, over the following centuries, into an ever-expanding compendium absorbing folk magic practices, astrological material, and increasingly elaborate ritual instructions from many different sources and periods. By the time printed editions began to circulate in the modern era, the text known as Shams al-Ma'rifa al-Kubra bore only a partial resemblance, in the view of many specialists, to whatever Al-Buni himself may have originally composed. This raises an uncomfortable question that modern scholars of Islamic intellectual history continue to wrestle with. Was Al-Buni himself a dangerous figure, a man who deliberately set out to compile forbidden knowledge? Or was he a sincere mystic and scholar, working within an established, if controversial, intellectual tradition, whose name and reputation were later hijacked by generations of anonymous copyists practitioners who attached increasingly extreme material to his legacy because his name carried authority and mystique? Many contemporary historians lean toward the latter view. They point out that Albuni also authored more sober theological and devotional works, and that the wilder, more magically explicit material attributed to him bears the hallmarks of later accretion. In this reading, the man became a kind of vessel, a brand name, if you will, onto which later generations projected an entire body of occult literature that grew organically over centuries, absorbing whatever seemed powerful, mysterious, or marketable at the time. If this is true, then the most dangerous book scholars tried to destroy was never really the product of a single dangerous mind. It was something closer to a living tradition, a river fed by countless tributaries, each contributor believing they were adding to something ancient and authoritative. Despite this murkiness, the reputation of the book only grew more fearsome with time. By the Ottoman period, we find repeated references in religious and legal literature to concerns about the spread of talismanic and magical texts, with Shams al-Marifa frequently singled out by name as an example of the kind of material that ought to be restricted or destroyed. Religious authorities in various Ottoman provinces issued warnings against its study. In some accounts, copies were seized from private libraries and burned publicly as a demonstration of religious orthodoxy and a warning to others. And yet, paradoxically, some of the very same Ottoman-era libraries that housed collections of religious jurisprudence condemning the book also, quietly, held copies of it themselves, tucked away in restricted sections, accessible only to scholars, with special permission. Studied not to be practiced but to be understood, catalogued, and refuted. This double life of the book, condemned publicly while preserved privately, is one of the most striking features of its history. Even those who wished to destroy it, in many cases, felt the need to first understand it, and understanding required preservation. There is also a psychological and sociological dimension to why this particular book, more than countless other works of Islamic esoterica, became the singular symbol of forbidden knowledge in the popular imagination. Part of it certainly has to do with sheer scale. Unlike smaller, more specialized treatises on astrology or amulet making that circulated among narrow circles of specialists, Shams al-Marifa was enormous and comprehensive, a kind of encyclopedia of the esoteric sciences. Its very comprehensiveness made it accessible to a wider audience than more technical works, since a person did not need extensive prior training to begin working through it. This accessibility, ironically, is likely part of what made religious authorities so uneasy. A specialized text that requires years of apprenticeship under a master before it can be understood poses less of a perceived threat to public order than a widely copied compendium that anyone literate in Arabic might pick up and attempt to use, potentially without any proper spiritual grounding or ethical framework, and potentially with disastrous consequences, whether those consequences were understood as spiritual corruption, mental derangement, or simply fraud committed against gullible people seeking magical solutions to their problems. Indeed, one of the recurring themes in the historical criticism of this book and its associated tradition is not simply theological objection, but also deep concern about exploitation. Throughout Islamic history, there existed a class of itinerant practitioners, sometimes respected, often viewed with suspicion, who offered services based on the kind of material found in works like Shams al-Marifa. These included the writing of protective amulets, the casting of charms to attract love or wealth, the diagnosis of jinn possession and the performance of exorcism rituals, and the preparation of talismans meant to influence everything from a person's health to their legal disputes to their romantic prospects. Many religious authorities viewed this entire economy with suspicion, seeing it as preying on the fears and desperation of ordinary people, extracting money and devotion in exchange for promises that could never be reliably verified. The book, in this light, was dangerous not merely because of abstract theological concerns about shirk, but because it provided the raw material, the scripts and formulas, that fueled an entire underground economy of exploitation. A desperate mother seeking to protect a sick child, a merchant hoping to secure a favorable outcome in a dispute, a young man hoping to win the affection of someone who did not return his feelings. All of these people were, across centuries, vulnerable to practitioners who claimed the authority of ancient and powerful texts to justify their fees and their promises. When religious scholars condemned Shams al-Marifa, they were often condemning not just a set of ideas, but an entire economy of manipulation that had grown up around those ideas. There is also the matter of psychological danger, which appears repeatedly in accounts and warnings associated with the book, even into the modern era. Practitioners and religious authorities alike have long claimed that engagement with the more intensive ritual material contained within the text particularly material relating to prolonged fasting, isolation, repetitive invocation, and attempts at direct communication with jinn or spirits, could produce genuine psychological harm. Modern observers looking back at these accounts through a contemporary lens might interpret many of the reported effects, such as extreme anxiety, hallucination, dissociation, or breakdown, as the predictable results of sleep deprivation, prolonged isolation, and the power of suggestion operating on individuals already primed by belief to expect frightening supernatural encounters. Whatever the underlying explanation, the reputation for psychological danger became deeply embedded in popular culture surrounding the book, to the point where warnings against attempting its rituals without proper spiritual guidance became almost as common as warnings against the theological impropriety of the rituals themselves. This dual reputation, dangerous to the soul and dangerous to the mind, cemented the book's status as something to be feared rather than casually explored. As centuries passed, the story of the book did not remain confined to the Islamic world. European scholars, travelers, and Orientalists, particularly from the 18th century onward, began to encounter references to al-Buni and his famous compendium as they explored Arabic manuscript collections across North Africa, Egypt, and the broader Middle East. This was an era of intense European fascination with what was often exoticized as the mysterious East, and esoteric and occult texts held particular appeal for a certain class of European scholar and collector. Manuscripts of Shams al-Marifa found their way into European libraries, sometimes through legitimate scholarly acquisition, sometimes through the colonial era plundering of archives and private collections that characterized much of the era's approach to non-European intellectual heritage. European Orientalist scholarship on the text was often colored by the assumptions of the time, treating it alternately as a curious artifact of Oriental superstition worthy of dismissive cataloging, or, among a smaller circle of occultists and esoteric enthusiasts in Europe, as a genuine repository of ancient magical wisdom to be mined, translated, and incorporated into Western occult traditions that were themselves experiencing a revival during this period. This period of European engagement added yet another layer to the book's dangerous reputation because it began to circulate, in partial and often poorly translated forms, among European occult circles interested in ceremonial magic, a movement that drew eclectically from Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and various non-Western esoteric traditions. Figures within this Western occult revival sometimes presented fragments of al-Buni's material, often stripped entirely of its original Islamic theological framework and ethical constraints, as exotic magical techniques to be practiced by initiates. This decontextualization, many scholars of Islamic studies argue, represents one of the most significant distortions in the book's long history. Material that within its original tradition was understood, however controversially, as operating within an Islamic cosmological and ethical framework, invoking the names of the one God and drawing on Quranic verses, was transplanted into an entirely different cultural and spiritual context, often blended with unrelated magical systems, and practiced by individuals with no grounding in the original tradition's internal logic or safeguards. Whatever one's view of the original material's validity or danger, this cross-cultural transplantation arguably created new and different risks, divorced from any of the original context that had, at least, in the eyes of its Muslim critics, attempted to constrain and regulate its use. Meanwhile, back within the Islamic world, the 20th century brought new pressures and new reasons for religious authorities to renew their long campaign against the book. The rise of reformist and revivalist religious movements across the Muslim world in the 19th and 20th centuries brought renewed scrutiny to what these movements often characterized as accumulated superstition and folk practice that had corrupted what they considered to be authentic, scripturally grounded Islamic practice. Reformist scholars, seeking to strip away centuries of what they viewed as innovation and superstition, frequently identified Shams al-Marifa and the broader tradition of talismanic magic as prime examples of the kind of corrupted practice that needed to be purged. Religious publishing houses in various countries issued renewed condemnations. Some governments, particularly those aligned with more conservative religious establishments, placed restrictions on the printing, sale, and distribution of the text, treating it alongside other material deemed religiously impermissible or socially harmful. And yet, in a pattern that by now should be familiar, these renewed efforts at suppression coincided with, rather than prevented, the book's increasing availability. The 20th century saw the first widespread printed editions of Shams al-Ma'arifa, produced by publishers across the Arab world who recognized a persistent and substantial market demand for the text, regardless of religious condemnation. What centuries of handwritten copying had done slowly, the printing press did quickly. And what the printing press began, the 21st century's digital revolution accelerated beyond anything earlier generations of censors could have anticipated. Today, the book that scholars across centuries sought to destroy is, in a strange twist of history, more accessible than it has ever been. Digital copies circulate freely online. Scanned manuscript pages, printed editions, and even video content discussing and demonstrating material drawn from the text are available to anyone with an internet connection, in a way that would have been utterly unimaginable to the religious scholars of the Ottoman period, who once ordered physical copies burned in public squares. This raises a fascinating question that I think deserves serious reflection tonight. What does it mean when a book that was, for centuries, one of the most actively suppressed texts in an entire civilization's intellectual history, becomes, through the simple accident of technological change, essentially unsuppressible? Every barrier that religious and political authorities once relied upon, control over scribes, control over paper and ink, control over the physical movement of manuscripts across borders, control over who was permitted to teach whom, has been dissolved by digital reproduction and global connectivity. The dangerous book that could once be hunted down copy by copy, confiscated and burned one manuscript at a time, now exists as an uncountable, endlessly replicable set of digital files that no religious authority, no government, and no library can meaningfully destroy. This forces us to reconsider what we even mean when we say a book is dangerous, and why societies throughout history have gone to such lengths to destroy books they fear. I would suggest to you tonight that the story of Shams al-Marifa is not really a story about magic at all, not fundamentally. It is a story about the eternal and unresolved tension between authority and knowledge, between those who believe certain forms of knowledge must be restricted for the good of society, and those who believe knowledge, however dangerous it might appear, has an almost irrepressible tendency to seek an audience. Every society throughout history has produced its own version of this story. Some societies have feared books that challenged political authority. Others have feared books that challenged religious orthodoxy. Others still have feared books, like this one, that occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, claiming to operate within the boundaries of accepted religion, while simultaneously offering practitioners techniques that seem to promise direct, personal access to supernatural power, bypassing the mediating authority of religious scholars, institutions, and hierarchies that had for centuries positioned themselves as the necessary guides between ordinary believers and the divine. This, I think, is perhaps the deepest and most overlooked reason why Shams al-Marifa provoked such sustained hostility from the religious establishment across so many centuries and so many different political regimes. It was not simply that the book contained material that could be theologically classified as forbidden. It was that the book offered ordinary people, without formal religious training, without the approval of any scholarly institution, without years of study under a recognized master, a set of techniques that promised direct results. Write this square, recite this name a certain number of times at a certain hour, and you will achieve this outcome. This promise of unmediated access to power, wrapped in the language and symbolism of a shared religious tradition, represented a fundamental challenge to religious hierarchies whose authority rested, in part, on their claimed monopoly over legitimate access to the sacred. A book that suggested anyone literate enough to read Arabic could, on their own, in the privacy of their own home, tap into forces capable of altering the outcome of their life circumstances was, in a very real sense, a threat to the entire structure of religious authority as it had been constructed over centuries. Small wonder, then, that this book, more than almost any other single text in the history of Islamic esoteric literature, became the target of such sustained and passionate condemnation. It is worth pausing here to consider what modern scholarship, operating with the tools of critical historical analysis rather than theological condemnation, has made of this remarkable text. Academic historians of science and mathematics have taken a particular interest in one specific dimension of the book that its religious critics rarely focused on, namely its extensive treatment of magic squares, those grids of numbers arranged so that every row, column, and diagonal sums to the same total. Far from being mere superstition, the mathematical study of these squares represents a genuinely significant chapter in the history of combinatorial mathematics. Scholars working within the Islamic mathematical tradition, including figures connected to the broader tradition that Al-Buni drew upon, made real and lasting contributions to the theory of these numerical arrangements. Contributions that predate and, in some cases, surpass comparable developments in the mathematical traditions of medieval Europe. Viewed through this lens, the mathematical portions of Shams al-Marifa represent not superstition but a genuine intellectual achievement, wrapped in a mystical framework that was entirely characteristic of how mathematical and scientific knowledge was often transmitted and understood in the medieval period, when the boundaries between what we would today separate into distinct categories of mathematics. Astrology, theology, and magic simply did not exist in the way modern secular categories assume they should. This observation invites a broader reflection on how easily we, looking back from the vantage point of the present, can mischaracterize the past by imposing our own categories onto it. When modern audiences hear that scholars try to destroy a book of magic, they often imagine a straightforward battle between rational, enlightened authorities and dangerous superstition, or alternatively, between narrow-minded religious censors and legitimate esoteric wisdom. Both of these framings, I would suggest, miss the far more interesting and complicated reality. The scholars who condemned Shams al-Marifa were not proto-rationalists dismissing superstition in the manner of a modern skeptic. Many of them fully accepted the existence of jinn, the reality of the unseen world, and the theoretical possibility that certain words and formulas might indeed carry real spiritual power. Their objection was not that the magic in the book did not work. Their objection was that engaging with it, whether or not it worked, was spiritually perilous and theologically forbidden, precisely because it might work, precisely because it offered a shortcut to power that bypassed the proper channels of devotion, submission, and reliance on God alone that orthodox Islamic theology demanded. This is a far more sophisticated and, I would argue, far more interesting position than a simple clash between rationalism and superstition, and it is a position that modern audiences, shaped by very different assumptions about the nature of reality, often struggle to fully appreciate. Let us also consider for a moment the fate of the man at the center of this story, Ahmad al-Buni himself. Unlike some authors of controversial texts throughout history, who suffered dramatic and well-documented persecution, we actually know remarkably little about what happened to al-Buni in his own lifetime. As a direct result of his writings, there is no widely attested account of him being tried, imprisoned, or executed for his work. He appears to have lived out his life largely undisturbed, dying sometime in the early decades of the 13th century, and only in the centuries following his death did the controversy around his most famous work truly intensify. This is itself a telling detail. It suggests that the transformation of Shams al-Marifa into the most feared and most actively suppressed book in the Islamic esoteric tradition was not primarily a response to al-Buni's own original intentions or original text, whatever that may have precisely contained, but rather a response to what the text became over the following centuries as it grew, absorbed new material, spread beyond its original scholarly context, and found its way into the hands of an ever-widening circle of practitioners whose use of the material, and whose understanding of its proper boundaries, religious authorities increasingly felt they could no longer control. I want to bring us back, in these final passages, to the question I posed near the beginning. Why does any of this matter to us today, sitting here in an age that likes to imagine itself as having moved beyond the fears and superstitions of the medieval world? I would suggest that the story of this book matters precisely because the underlying dynamics it illustrates have never actually disappeared. Every era produces its own version of the dangerous book, the text that authorities, whether religious, political, or institutional, decide must be restricted, banned, burned, or suppressed, precisely because it offers ordinary people access to something those authorities believe should remain controlled. And every era, it seems, eventually discovers what the story of Shams al-Marifa teaches so vividly, which is that the desire to suppress a text and the practical ability to actually suppress it are two very different things. Books, once written and once copied even a handful of times, have historically proven remarkably difficult to erase entirely from human memory. The very act of condemnation often generates curiosity. The very act of banning often generates demand. And the very act of declaring something forbidden often does more to guarantee its survival than any deliberate effort at preservation ever could. Because forbidden things acquire a mystique, a gravitational pull on human curiosity, that ordinary, permitted things simply do not possess. There is something almost poetic in the fact that a book condemned so relentlessly for offering shortcuts to hidden power ended up, through the sheer persistence of human curiosity across 8 centuries, achieving a kind of power all its own, not the power its pages claim to offer through talismans and invocations, but the more mundane and yet more remarkable power of sheer survival against every attempt to erase it. Kings ordered it burned. Scholars declared its readers heretics. Governments restricted its printing. And yet here we are in the 21st century, still speaking its name, still studying its history, still trying to understand what it was, who wrote it, what it meant, and why it frightened so many powerful people for so many centuries. In the end, perhaps the most dangerous thing about Shams al-Ma'arifa was never really the magic squares or the invocations or the talismans described within its pages. Perhaps the most dangerous thing about it was simply the fact that people wanted to read it, and that wanting, once ignited, proved to be the one force that no scholar, no king, and no fire could ever fully extinguish. And so the book endures, not because its magic proved true, and not because its critics were wrong to worry, but because that is simply what books do when enough people believe they matter. They survive their would-be destroyers. They outlast the fires lit against them. They pass quietly from hand to hand, from generation to generation, carrying within them not just their original words, but the entire tangled history of everyone who ever tried to save them, and everyone who ever tried to destroy them, and everyone, across 8 long centuries, who simply could not stop wondering what secrets might be waiting inside. Thank you.